In the remote hills of East Texas, where endless plains meet the pine forests, there once stood a series of camps promising salvation to the damned. From 1845 to 1881, over 300 souls entered these redemption camps, seeking forgiveness for their sins. Only a handful ever left alive. The survivors spoke in whispers of purification rituals so extreme that death seemed merciful by comparison. What federal investigators discovered when they finally breached these camps in 1881 was far more horrifying than religious fanaticism. They found a secret cemetery holding the remains of nearly 200 victims, each bearing signs of prolonged torture. But what they uncovered in the Damnation Family's private ledgers would shake the very foundations of frontier justice, revealing a criminal enterprise so elaborate it had operated undetected for more than 3 decades. Tonight, we uncover the complete story of the most successful serial killers in American frontier history and the twisted salvation they offered to the desperate and the damned. Before we continue with the reign of terror disguised as salvation, let me ask you something. This channel isn't for everyone. Only for those brave enough to face the darkest chapters of American history. If you're one of the few who can handle stories like this, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. The truth we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, justice, and the price of redemption on the American frontier. The year was 1845. Texas had just joined the Union as the 28th state after nearly a decade as an independent republic. The frontier was a vast, lawless expanse where desperate men and women fled from their pasts, seeking redemption or ruin in equal measure. It was a land where a man's word was his bond, where justice often came at the end of a rope, and where religious fervor burned as hot as the summer sun. Along the dusty trails connecting sparse settlements across hundreds of miles, word began to spread of 3 brothers who offered something precious to the damned, immediate salvation through purification of the flesh. The Damnation Family, Preacher Malachi, Evangelist Cornelius, and Prophet Jebediah, had arrived in Texas from Arkansas in early 1845, carrying letters of recommendation from various Baptist and Methodist congregations throughout the South. Preacher Malachi Damnation stood 6 feet tall with penetrating gray eyes that seemed to look straight into a man's soul. His black hair was always perfectly groomed, and his voice possessed an otherworldly quality that could make hardened killers weep. At 35, he was the eldest and most charismatic of the 3, capable of delivering sermons that left audiences both terrified and exhilarated. Evangelist Cornelius, 2 years younger, possessed an uncanny ability to read the guilt written on a person's face. He could identify a man's specific sins with such accuracy that many believed he had supernatural powers. His thin frame and hollow cheeks gave him an ascetic appearance that reinforced his reputation for spiritual insight. Cornelius specialized in what the brothers called confession extraction, getting sinners to reveal their darkest secrets. The youngest brother, Prophet Jebediah, claimed to receive visions directly from the Almighty. At 28, he was built like a blacksmith, with massive hands he claimed were blessed with healing powers. His role was to oversee the physical aspects of purification, ensuring each penitent received exactly the level of suffering their sins demanded. Together, they established a network of redemption camps along the most desolate stretches of East Texas, where the cypress swamps met the piney woods and civilization felt like a distant memory. The camps appeared modest from the outside, canvas tents arranged in perfect circles around rough wooden crosses, with a central fire pit where the brothers would preach to gatherings of desperate souls. The clientele was exactly what one would expect on the frontier. Cowboys fleeing rustling charges, prostitutes seeking escape from brutal brothel owners, gamblers drowning in debt, murderers running from vigilante justice, and deserters from both the Mexican War and various Indian conflicts. But the camps also attracted a surprising number of seemingly respectable citizens, merchants guilty of fraud, politicians fleeing corruption scandals, and even legitimate seekers of spiritual guidance who had heard of the brothers' reputation for miraculous transformations. The Damnation Brothers preached a harsh gospel of immediate purification that resonated with the violent, unforgiving nature of frontier life. Sin must be burned away like chaff in the fire, Malachi would thunder, his voice echoing through the pines as flames danced across his angular face. The flesh must suffer so the spirit can soar to eternal glory. There are no shortcuts to salvation, only the narrow path of pain that leads to paradise. Their reputation for producing miraculous transformations spread throughout Texas and into neighboring states. According to testimonials that appeared regularly in frontier newspapers, men entered the camps as hardened sinners and emerged as new creations, gentle as lambs, pure as mountain snow, ready to spread the gospel to the furthest corners of the earth. It was on a sweltering August night in 1847 that the first disturbing reports began to surface, though few paid attention at the time. A cattle driver named Samuel Hartwell stumbled into the town of Marshall, Texas, barely alive and speaking in terrified whispers about what he had witnessed at a redemption camp near the mysterious waters of Caddo Lake. Hartwell's appearance was shocking. Once a robust man in his 30s, he now appeared gaunt and prematurely aged, his hair having turned completely white. His hands shook uncontrollably, and he would flinch violently at unexpected sounds. Most disturbing were his eyes, once bright blue, they now held a hollow, haunted quality that suggested he had seen things no man should witness. His story was fragmented, told between fits of trembling and moments of catatonic silence. According to the local pastor who took him in, Hartwell would wake each night screaming about the pit of purification and the screaming that never stopped. During lucid moments, he spoke of arriving at the camp seeking forgiveness for killing a man in a saloon fight. They said the pain would cleanse my soul, Hartwell whispered to Pastor William Matthews, his voice barely audible. Brother Malachi looked into my eyes and told me exactly what I had done. Not just the killing, but things I'd never told another living soul. He knew about the money I'd stolen from my mother before leaving Arkansas. He knew about the woman I'd left pregnant in New Orleans. He knew everything. According to Hartwell's account, the purification process began immediately. New penitents were stripped of all possessions, including their clothes, and given rough burlap robes to wear. They were then required to confess not only the sin that had brought them to the camp, but every transgression they had ever committed. Brother Cornelius would sit across from you with this ledger, Hartwell recalled, his voice monotone, as if reciting from memory. He'd write down everything you said, and if he suspected you were holding something back, Brother Jebediah would use his gifts to help you remember. Those hands of his, they could cause pain you couldn't imagine. The confession process could take days or weeks depending on the perceived honesty of the penitent. Only when the brothers were satisfied that every sin had been revealed would the physical purification begin. This started with a complete fast, 7 days with nothing but water, during which the penitent was forced to dig their own grave as a symbol of their spiritual death. The hunger was nothing compared to what came next, Hartwell continued, his entire body beginning to shake. They called it the trial of fire. Beatings with leather whips that had metal fragments sewn into them. Each lash was supposed to represent a specific sin being scourged from your flesh, but it went on for hours, sometimes days. But the physical torture was only the beginning. Hartwell described ritualistic burials where penitents were placed in the graves they had dug and covered with dirt, leaving only their faces exposed. They would remain buried for varying lengths of time while the brothers prayed over them and declared their spiritual death complete. Some of them never came back up, Hartwell whispered, his eyes wide with terror. Brother Malachi would stand over the graves and declare them perfectly purified. Said they'd been called home to glory. But I saw their faces when they went under. There was no peace, only absolute terror. The most horrifying aspect was his description of those who didn't survive. According to him, the brothers maintained that death during purification was the ultimate blessing, proof that the individual had achieved such complete spiritual cleansing that God had called them directly to paradise. They had a special ceremony for the ones who died, Hartwell recalled. Brother Malachi would read from the Bible while Brother Jebediah covered the grave, and then they'd plant a wooden cross and add the person's name to what they called the roll of the redeemed. They said these souls were the lucky ones. They'd skipped purgatory entirely. Local authorities in Marshall initially dismissed Hartwell's story as the ravings of a man broken by guilt and frontier madness. After all, no one had come forward to report missing persons, and the Damnation brothers had impeccable credentials. They carried letters of recommendation from churches throughout Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, along with testimonials from grateful families. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a practical man who had seen his share of frontier violence, was particularly skeptical. The frontier is full of men running from something, he told Pastor Matthews. Sounds to me like Hartwell got religion the hard way and his mind snapped under the strain. These revival preachers can get pretty enthusiastic, but murder, that's a serious accusation to make without proof. The matter was quietly dropped, and within a month, Hartwell himself had disappeared. Some said he'd moved on to California. Others claimed he'd returned to Arkansas. Pastor Matthews suspected something more sinister, but without evidence, there was nothing he could do. The camps continued to operate without interference, their reputation for miraculous conversions growing with each passing season. But Hartwell's disappearance was just the beginning of a pattern that would emerge over the following decades. As months turned to years, the legend of the Damnation Family's miraculous conversions spread throughout the South and beyond. They claimed to have saved over 1,000 souls, transforming the most hardened criminals into model citizens who went forth to spread the gospel. Testimonial letters arrived regularly at newspapers throughout Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, praising the brothers' work. The testimonials followed a consistent pattern. A desperate sinner would arrive, undergo purification, and emerge a new person. Within weeks, they would feel called to missionary work in remote territories, California, Oregon, the Rocky Mountains, or deep into Indian Territory. Their final letters to family members spoke of an overwhelming desire to bring salvation to the unreached, often requesting financial support. Yet for those who looked closely, there were troubling patterns. The redemption camps moved frequently, never staying in one location for more than 6 months. The brothers explained this as following God's calling, but it made tracking their activities nearly impossible for law enforcement. More disturbing were the accounts of families who sent wayward sons or daughters to the camps, only to receive letters months later informing them their loved ones had been so transformed they'd felt called to missionary work in distant territories. These family members were never seen or heard from again. But the Damnation brothers always had explanations, and often forged letters to account for their absence. Mrs. Eleanor Westbrook of New Orleans became one of the first to question the brothers' claims when her son Thomas, a gambling addict with mounting debts, disappeared after entering a camp near Shreveport in 1849. Initially, she received regular letters describing his spiritual transformation and growing desire to spread the gospel in California. The letters contained enough personal details to convince her of their authenticity, and Thomas even requested money to support his work. "At first I was overjoyed," Mrs. Westbrook would later tell investigators. Thomas had been heading down a dark path, and these letters suggested he had found salvation. But something about the handwriting bothered me. It looked like Thomas's writing, but there were subtle differences, the way he formed certain letters, the phrases he used. I began to suspect someone was copying his style. When Mrs. Westbrook hired a private investigator to locate her son in California, the results were deeply troubling. None of the churches or missions in the areas Thomas claimed to be working had any record of him. The addresses he provided were either non-existent or occupied by people who had never heard of Thomas Westbrook. Similar stories began to emerge from across the region. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, a traveling physician who had treated several survivors of the camps, began to notice a disturbing pattern in their symptoms. They exhibited signs of severe trauma, she would later testify. Not the peaceful countenance of the spiritually redeemed, but the hollow stare of those who had witnessed unspeakable horrors. The few survivors who did return to civilization were indeed changed, but not in the way the brothers claimed. They spoke little, started at sudden noises, and seemed to carry a burden of knowledge too terrible to share. Most disturbing was their universal reluctance to discuss their time at the camps, as if bound by some unholy oath of silence. Dr. Thornton documented several cases that particularly troubled her. Jacob Miller, a former outlaw who had survived the purification process, displayed symptoms I had only seen in soldiers who had witnessed the worst atrocities of war, she noted in her journal. He would wake screaming about the pit and the ceremony of ascension. When pressed for details, he would only say that some forms of salvation came at too high a price. Another survivor, a woman named Sarah Colby who had sought redemption after abandoning her children, returned to her family a broken shell. She would spend hours staring at nothing, her sister Mary reported. Sometimes she would whisper prayers, but they weren't normal prayers. She would ask God to forgive her for the things she had seen, not the things she had done. Perhaps most telling was the case of Reverend Peter Hawkins, a Methodist minister who had volunteered to observe the Damnation Brothers' methods. Hawkins emerged just as traumatized as any other survivor. There are forms of evil that masquerade as righteousness, Hawkins told Dr. Thornton. I went seeking inspiration for my ministry and found something that shook my faith to its core. The brothers are not servants of God. They are something else entirely, something that uses our deepest spiritual needs as weapons against us. When pressed for specifics, Hawkins would only say that the true purpose of the camps had nothing to do with salvation and everything to do with exploitation. He refused to elaborate, claiming that speaking the truth would only endanger others. The pattern of mysterious disappearances and traumatized survivors continued throughout the 1850s and into the 1860s. The chaos of the Civil War provided perfect cover for the Damnation Brothers' activities. With entire populations displaced and communication systems disrupted, it became even easier for people to vanish without explanation. However, the end of the war brought new challenges for the brothers and new opportunities for those seeking to expose their crimes. In the spring of 1879, a young Texas Ranger named Captain James Morrison began investigating reports of missing persons throughout East Texas. Morrison was a methodical man with a background in military intelligence, and he noticed something others had missed, a pattern of disappearances that seemed to follow the movement of the redemption camps. Morrison had been assigned to the case after receiving a formal complaint from Senator Charles Whitman of Louisiana, whose nephew had disappeared after entering a damnation camp near the Texas border. Unlike previous investigations, Morrison had the authority and funding to conduct a comprehensive multi-state investigation. "There's something here that doesn't add up," Morrison wrote in his initial report. "I've documented over 60 missing persons cases in the past 3 years alone, all connected to these redemption camps. That's not counting cases from earlier years or other states where records are incomplete." Morrison's investigation led him to interview dozens of families. The stories were remarkably similar. Loved ones would seek redemption. Correspondence would continue for several weeks describing their transformation, then abruptly cease with a final letter explaining their calling to missionary work in remote locations. The ranger's suspicions deepened when he attempted to verify these missionary claims. Letters sent to the addresses provided were returned as undeliverable. Churches and missions had no record of their arrival. Most damning, Morrison discovered that several of the testimonial letters contained identical phrases and even identical grammatical errors. Someone is manufacturing these testimonials, Morrison concluded. The question is whether we're dealing with fraud, kidnapping, or something worse. Morrison's breakthrough came when he encountered a man named Tobias Fletcher in a tavern in Jefferson, Texas. Fletcher was drunk and rambling, but his story was coherent enough to send chills down Morrison's spine. Fletcher claimed to have worked as a gravedigger and laborer for the Damnation brothers for nearly 2 years in the mid-1870s. "I thought I was helping with the Lord's work," Fletcher whispered, his hands shaking. "Brother Malachi told me I was blessed to assist in the purification of souls. But some of those graves weren't for show. Some stayed filled permanent. He'd pray over them and declare another soul saved for eternity. But I knew what was really buried down there." According to Fletcher, his duties included digging symbolic graves and disposing of the bodies of those who ascended during purification. The brothers maintained these individuals had achieved such complete cleansing that God had called them directly to paradise. But Fletcher had seen enough bodies to know the difference between natural death and murder. The way Brother Jebediah would work with his hands, Fletcher continued, his voice dropping. He claimed it was healing. But I saw what those hands could do. He could make a man suffer for days without killing him, drawing out every bit of information about family, money, property. Then, when they had everything they needed, he'd finish the job. Fletcher described a sophisticated operation. The brothers would extract detailed information about their victims' assets during prolonged torture sessions. They would then use this to forge correspondence with family members, requesting money for fictional missionary work while providing plausible explanations for why the missionary couldn't return home. The money kept coming, Fletcher revealed. Families would send funds to support their loved ones' work spreading the gospel. The brothers had it set up so the money would be forwarded through multiple intermediaries, impossible to trace back to them. Some families kept sending money for years, never knowing their sons and daughters were dead and buried in unmarked graves. When Morrison pressed Fletcher for details about the location of these graves, the man's demeanor changed completely. Terror replaced drunken bravado. "They got eyes everywhere," Fletcher stammered, suddenly sober. "People who asked too many questions about the brothers, they got a way of disappearing, too. I shouldn't have said nothing. God help me." Fletcher fled the tavern that night and was never seen again. Some said he'd headed for California. Others claimed he'd been found dead in the swamps. Morrison suspected the latter, but Fletcher had provided enough information to narrow the search to a specific area near the Louisiana border. Armed with this intelligence, Morrison assembled a small team of trusted rangers and set out for the region near Caddo Lake. The journey took them through remote, forbidding terrain, dense forests and cypress swamps that seemed to swallow sound. Morrison's team consisted of Sergeant Bill Crawford, Corporal Miguel Santos, and Private David Thompson. Each man had been chosen for his discretion as well as his skills. As they approached the area, they began to notice disturbing signs. The local wildlife seemed unusually scarce. The few settlers they encountered warned them away, speaking of unholy ground and cursed soil. An old trapper named Ezekiel Marsh told them, "Ain't nothing natural about that place. Animals won't go near it, and the few that do come back changed, if they come back at all." The team made camp several miles from the redemption site, planning to observe before making any move. On their first night, they heard distant sounds carried on the wind, unmistakable sounds of human suffering, screaming, pleading, and religious chanting in unrecognizable languages. It wasn't the cry of someone in physical pain, Morrison would later write. It was the sound of a soul in absolute torment, pleading for mercy that would never come. The worst part was how it would stop abruptly, then start again hours later, as if the suffering was being deliberately prolonged. When dawn broke, the Rangers conducted a reconnaissance. What they discovered in the woods surrounding the camp would challenge everything they thought they knew about the scope of the Damnation family's crimes. Fresh graves dotted the landscape, over 60 that appeared to have been dug within the past year alone, each marked with a simple wooden cross bearing only a number. But it was the smell that convinced Morrison they had found something genuinely horrific. Despite efforts to manage the burial ground, the unmistakable odor of decomposition hung heavy in the humid air. Private Thompson confirmed it. "That's the smell of a lot of bodies, Captain. Fresh ones and old ones, too. Whatever's happening here, it's been going on for a long time." As they moved closer, they began to hear sounds that made their blood run cold. From the largest tent came the rhythmic sound of metal striking flesh, accompanied by agonized screaming and religious incantations. The voice delivering the incantations was calm, almost conversational, a horrifying contrast with the obvious suffering. Morrison realized they were witnessing an active torture session. The decision to intervene was made for him when the screaming suddenly stopped, replaced by an ominous silence. They had just witnessed a murder. Now their priority was gathering evidence and preventing future atrocities. Using hand signals, Morrison deployed his men around the perimeter. What they observed over the next several hours would provide the foundation for one of the most significant criminal prosecutions in frontier history. The brothers operated with the efficiency of a well-established business, their activities following a precise schedule. Each morning began with a legitimate-seeming religious service. But as the day progressed, the facade gave way to something sinister. Individual counseling sessions would begin, during which Brother Cornelius extracted detailed confessions. These sessions often lasted for hours, with increasingly desperate pleading from inside the confession tent. Brother Cornelius has a gift for knowing exactly what people are hiding, Morrison noted. But I'm beginning to suspect this divine insight comes from more earthly sources, prolonged interrogation combined with psychological manipulation, and probably torture. The brothers had perfected a system for extracting not only confessions, but detailed financial information. They would use this to craft convincing forged correspondence, often continuing these fictional relationships for months or even years after the victim's death. Private Thompson reported observing Brother Jebediah's healing sessions, which were actually torture sessions. "He's got a collection of tools that would make a Spanish inquisitor proud," Thompson whispered. "And he knows exactly how to use them to cause maximum pain without killing too quickly." The most disturbing aspect was its systematic nature. They had clearly developed their methods over many years, refining techniques for extracting information, forging documents, and disposing of bodies. On the second night, the Rangers witnessed what the brothers called a ceremony of ascension, their euphemism for murder. A penitent who had undergone days of torture was brought to the center of the camp, where Brother Malachi delivered a sermon about the blessing of spiritual purification. The victim, barely conscious, was then ceremonially released from earthly bonds by Brother Jebediah. "They're not killing in a fit of religious madness," Morrison wrote. "This is cold, calculated murder performed with the precision of a business transaction. The religious elements are just window dressing." The ceremony concluded with the victim being buried in one of the numbered graves. Brother Malachi recorded the ascension in a leather-bound ledger. The Rangers realized they were witnessing the final step in a process repeated hundreds of times over 3 decades. But they also discovered evidence that the crimes extended far beyond murder for profit. Hidden in the woods, they found a workshop where documents were forged and other criminal activities planned. The brothers had been involved in everything from counterfeiting to fraud schemes spanning multiple states. "We're not just dealing with serial killers," Morrison concluded. "We're looking at one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history. These men have been using religion as a cover for every type of crime imaginable for decades." On their third day, something forced them to abandon observation and take immediate action. A family of 4, parents and 2 young children, arrived at the camp seeking family purification. The sight of children being led into the camp made it impossible for Morrison to wait any longer. "I couldn't stand by and watch children become victims of these monsters," Morrison later explained. "We had enough evidence to prove their guilt, and we had a duty to protect innocent life." Morrison planned to arrest the brothers during their evening service. However, the Rangers quickly discovered the Damnation Family was far more dangerous than anticipated. The brothers had planned for law enforcement intervention and had several heavily armed accomplices posing as camp workers. What followed was a gunfight that lasted nearly an hour, leaving 2 accomplices dead and Sergeant Crawford wounded. During the battle, they discovered some of the camp's penitents had been so thoroughly broken they actually tried to defend their tormentors. "They begged us not to hurt their saviors," Private Thompson reported. "Some of them actually threw themselves between us and the brothers, convinced that we were agents of Satan. It was the most disturbing thing I've ever witnessed." The brothers themselves proved formidable. Brother Malachi was an excellent marksman. Brother Jebediah's massive size and strength made him dangerous even without weapons. Brother Cornelius demonstrated an uncanny ability to manipulate people even in combat. The turning point came when Morrison reached the tent where the brothers kept their records. Inside, he found not only detailed accounts of their crimes, but evidence of their true identities. The Damnation name was an alias. The brothers were actually the Blackwood family, wanted for murder and fraud in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Everything about them was a lie, Morrison discovered. They weren't misguided religious fanatics. They were career criminals who had found the perfect disguise. With their true identities exposed, their resistance began to crumble. One by one, they were taken into custody, though not before Brother Cornelius took a child hostage. The standoff that followed revealed the true depth of their depravity. When Morrison attempted to negotiate, Brother Cornelius calmly explained that the child had already been marked for purification, and that killing him would be an act of mercy. "You don't understand the service we provide," he told Morrison with chilling calm. "These people come to us broken, sinful, worthless. We give their lives meaning. Death during purification is the highest honor we can bestow." Private Thompson ended the standoff with a perfectly placed shot that wounded Brother Cornelius without harming the child. The remaining accomplices surrendered. With the brothers in custody, Morrison's team began the grim task of uncovering the full scope of their crimes. What they discovered exceeded even their worst expectations. The brothers' record-keeping was meticulous and damning. Their ledgers contained detailed information about more than 400 victims, including names, methods of execution, and amounts of money extracted. They kept records like it was a business, Morrison reported. Each victim was assigned a number. How much money was stolen, what information was extracted, even which torture methods were most effective. It's the most coldly methodical approach to murder I've ever encountered. Excavation of the numbered graves revealed nearly 200 remains, most showing signs of prolonged torture. Forensic examination by Dr. Elizabeth Thornton revealed the sophisticated nature of their methods. They had clearly studied human anatomy and psychology, she reported. Their techniques were designed to maximize suffering while keeping victims alive as long as possible. The discovery that shocked investigators most was evidence that the brothers had been experimenting with different torture methods, apparently seeking to develop more effective interrogation techniques. Some victims showed signs of having been subjected to multiple methods over extended periods. This wasn't just about extracting money or information, Morrison concluded. I believe these men derived genuine pleasure from causing suffering. The religious framework provided justification for their sadistic impulses. The workshop yielded additional evidence, document forgery equipment, printing plates for counterfeit currency, stolen religious artifacts modified for torture, and maps showing locations of other camps. Most disturbing was a training manual written by Brother Malachi detailing methods for identifying and exploiting vulnerable individuals. They had turned human exploitation into a science, Dr. Thornton observed. Every aspect was calculated to maximize profit while minimizing risk. It's a level of systematic evil that defies comprehension. The scope of their network became clear when investigators examined correspondence with accomplices in other states. The Damnation Family was part of a larger criminal organization that included forgers, con artists, and corrupt law enforcement officials paid to look the other way. As word of their arrest spread, a flood of new information poured in from across the South. Letters described similar camps and suspicious disappearances dating back to the early 1840s. Mrs. Catherine Phillips of Mobile wrote about her husband's disappearance in 1852 after attending a purification camp operated by three brothers matching the Damnation's description. Samuel received letters from our son for nearly 2 years, she explained. The letters described his missionary work in California and requested money. We sent over $800 before the letters stopped coming. Similar stories emerged from Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Indian Territory. A pattern emerged of camps operating for 6 to 12 months in remote locations before moving on. They understood how to exploit the weaknesses in our system, Morrison noted. They chose locations where authorities were overwhelmed or corrupt, and they moved on before anyone could build a case. The brothers had cultivated relationships with corrupt officials who provided advanced warning and helped establish false credentials. Several sheriffs, judges, and ministers were implicated. The financial scope was staggering. Investigators estimated they had extracted over $50,000 from victims' families, an enormous sum for the time. But the psychological damage extended far beyond financial loss. Families had spent years believing their loved ones were performing noble work, only to discover they had been murdered within days or weeks of entering the camps. Do you believe humans are capable of such calculated evil? The Damnation Brothers' crimes force us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil itself. Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story has gripped you, hit that like button and subscribe for more dark mysteries from America's past. Now, let's continue with the brothers' final reckoning. The legal proceedings became one of the most sensational criminal trials in Texas history. The courthouse was packed daily with spectators, reporters, and family members of victims. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Maxwell, faced the task of presenting evidence of crimes spanning nearly 4 decades and multiple states. Gentlemen of the jury, Maxwell declared, You are about to hear evidence of crimes so heinous, so systematically evil that they challenge our fundamental beliefs about human nature. The defendants have masqueraded as servants of God while serving only their own twisted desires. The defense, led by James Worthington, attempted to portray the brothers as misguided zealots. My clients are guilty of excessive zeal, perhaps criminal negligence, Worthington argued. But they are not cold-blooded killers. They are men who became so consumed with saving souls that they lost sight of earthly limits. This strategy crumbled when the prosecution presented testimony from survivors and excerpts from the brothers' records. The methodical nature of their crimes made it impossible to maintain the fiction of religious motivation. Brother Malachi's testimony proved particularly damaging. He spoke with cold pride about their efficiency and success in avoiding detection. We provided a service that society needed but was unwilling to acknowledge, he testified with chilling calm. The frontier is full of broken people with no purpose. We gave their meaningless lives meaning. When asked to explain the torture and murder, his response shocked the courtroom. Death is inevitable for all men. We simply made sure these deaths served a useful purpose. The money supported important work these individuals could never have accomplished on their own. Brother Cornelius was equally unrepentant. He described his methods for extracting confessions as if explaining a business model. People want to confess, he explained matter-of-factly. They carry guilt that poisons their souls. My gift was knowing how to help them overcome their reluctance to tell the complete truth. Brother Jebediah described his torture methods with the enthusiasm of a craftsman. Pain is a teacher, he explained. It strips away pretense and reveals truth. My hands were blessed with the ability to apply exactly the right amount of pressure. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton provided expert medical testimony. These men had clearly studied human anatomy and psychology, she testified. Their methods were designed to maximize suffering while keeping victims alive as long as possible. The work of experts, not religious fanatics. The most powerful testimony came from survivors. Samuel Hartwell, brought back despite his trauma, described how the brothers operated. They didn't just want to kill us, he testified, his voice barely audible. They wanted to break us completely first, body, mind, and spirit. The torture wasn't just about extracting information. They enjoyed watching us suffer. Other survivors corroborated his account. Rebecca Marsh described psychological manipulation. They would tell you your suffering was necessary for salvation, she testified. They made you feel grateful for the torture. By the time they were finished, you believed dying would be a mercy. Jacob Wheeler, a former accomplice, provided insider details. They had it all mapped out, he testified. They knew exactly how long they could operate in each location. They had escape routes planned. They even had contingency plans if law enforcement got too close. Wheeler revealed they had been planning to expand to California and Oregon. They saw the western migration as a business opportunity, he explained. All those people heading west with money and no family connections to track them if they disappeared. One of the most shocking moments came when the prosecution revealed their true identities. Court records showed that Damnation brothers were actually Jacob, Cornelius, and Josiah Blackwood, wanted since 1841. They had killed a wealthy merchant who discovered their fraud in Little Rock, fled west, and assumed the identities of deceased ministers. Everything about their religious personas was carefully constructed fiction, Prosecutor Maxwell revealed. Their entire identity was an elaborate disguise. Further evidence revealed Jebediah was actually Walter Grimm, a former soldier discharged for brutality during the Mexican War. He had joined the Blackwoods in the late 1840s and was included in their assumed family. After deliberating less than 3 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Harrison Caldwell delivered sentences reflecting the unprecedented nature of the crimes. "In my 30 years on the bench," he declared, "I have never encountered evil of such systematic, calculated nature. Your crimes represent an assault on the very foundations of civilized society." Jacob Blackwood, Malachi, was sentenced to death for 17 counts of first-degree murder. Cornelius Blackwood received the same for 12 counts of murder and numerous counts of fraud and torture. Walter Grimm, Jebediah, was sentenced to death for 23 counts of murder. The sentences were carried out on November 15, 1882, before a crowd of over 2,000. Even on the gallows, they showed no remorse. Jacob Blackwood's final words, "We gave meaning to meaningless lives. History will vindicate our methods." Walter Grimm spoke last. "There are others like us out there. We were not unique. The frontier breeds predators, and there will always be those who know how to exploit the desperate and the damned." The Damnation case became a turning point in frontier law enforcement, leading to new requirements for religious organizations and increased cooperation between agencies across state lines. It highlighted the vulnerability of isolated populations and the need for better communication systems. Dr. Thornton used her experience to write one of the first comprehensive studies of criminal psychology, focusing on methods used by systematic killers to exploit vulnerable victims. Her work became a foundation for modern criminal profiling. The financial impact extended far beyond immediate victims. Families who had been sending money to support fictional missionary work were ruined. Communities that took pride in supporting evangelical work were devastated. Captain Morrison was promoted to major and placed in charge of a new multi-state task force. His methodical approach became a model for complex criminal investigations throughout the American West. The sites of the camps remained largely abandoned, avoided by locals who believed the ground was cursed. Even today, more than a century later, some remote areas of East Texas are said to be haunted by the spirits of those who sought salvation and found only horror. The story of the Damnation Family forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Their crimes were made possible not only by their own depravity, but by a social system that failed to protect its most vulnerable. They succeeded because they understood how to exploit gaps in frontier society, poor communication between jurisdictions, reluctance to investigate the disappearance of outcasts, and the assumption that religious activities were inherently benevolent. They turned society's best impulses, faith, hope, the desire for redemption, into weapons against those who most needed protection. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization they were not anomalies, but products of a system that created ideal conditions for predatory behavior. The frontier's isolation, desperation, and weak law enforcement created opportunities exploited by those willing to embrace absolute evil. Their story serves as a permanent reminder that evil often wears the mask of righteousness, and the most dangerous predators are those who exploit our deepest spiritual and emotional needs. In a world where people seek meaning and redemption, there will always be those ready to offer false salvation at the ultimate price. The Damnation Family claimed to offer salvation to the damned. But they proved some forms of damnation are far worse than any sin their victims had ever committed. Their legacy is written in unmarked graves across the American frontier, a testament to the depths of human evil and the price of misplaced trust. What do you think about this dark chapter of American frontier history? Do you believe such systematic evil could exist today? Or were the Damnation Brothers products of their unique time and place? Leave your thoughts below. If you found this story chilling, subscribe and hit that notification bell. The American frontier holds many more dark secrets waiting to be uncovered. Share this with someone who appreciates the shadows of history. And remember, sometimes the greatest evil comes disguised as salvation. Until next time, stay vigilant against those who would exploit faith for their own twisted purposes.